all afternoon, so we're going to make a start. Welcome and good afternoon. Big welcome to you all. We're really grateful to you all for giving up your time, a couple of hours of your time in your busy schedules this afternoon. We are here to talk about the Statutory Biodiversity Metric, and we are joined and are going to be led by colleagues from DEFRA and Natural England. Welcome to everyone from Natural England and DEFRA. I am Martin Hutchings. I have the privilege of being your host this afternoon. I am slightly new to BNG, but I've been on the PAS team for over 15 years now, and I'm responsible for helping local councils get their plans in place. Now, my colleague Becky Mobley, she's described the PAS BNG network, who I'm sure many of you are a part of, as fantastically positive, helpful and engaged. So I'm really looking forward to delivering this session for you today and receiving your questions and input. Bit of housekeeping, so you'll probably notice microphones and cameras are off. That just helps us manage the presentations. We have got what's known as a Slido, which is a website that allows you to go onto the website and ask questions that we can record for this session. There's a code on the screen there. You can either go to slido.com and enter that code, or if you've got a smartphone, you can scan the QR code that's on your screen, and that will get you into Slido, where you can ask questions or you can see other questions. And if you see a question that you like, please give it a thumbs up. We try and avoid, if possible, asking the same question. Give it a thumbs up if you like the question, then we'll know it's popular and we can go to that later on. We're going to answer as many as we can, as many relevant questions to today's session as we can. Anything that we don't get to, apologies, but what we will be doing is we are recording this session, and we will record all of those Slido questions and we'll put them, the relevant ones, into our BNG frequently asked questions on our website. We're going to be using polls later on, so we're going to ask you a couple of questions towards the end of the session just to ask you how things have gone and anything that you're particularly interested in. And as I say, we're recording this and we'll make the recording and the slides available as soon as possible. So in the next few days, as soon as we've sort of processed things. Any technical issues that you're having, you probably, I was just thinking when I put this on that you probably won't see, won't be seeing me for me to tell you this, but if you've got any technical issues during the presentations, please email paz@local.gov.uk, as we'll pick that up and we'll try and sort things out for you. So what's next? Okay, the agenda. I'll finish the welcome and introduction shortly. Just 1 second, I've got my slides out of sync. Right, the agenda. Yeah, I'll finish my welcome in shortly. Then Katie Gowers from DEFRA is going to talk a bit about how the statutory metric came about and what it being statutory means. Then Sam Wilson is going to take us through how the metric works, and then we'll go through some Q&A and get to as many questions as we can with the team. Just quickly, if you are new to Planning Advisory Service, we're funded by DLUC, Department of Levelling Up, Homes and Communities, but we sit within the Local Government Association. So we're very much part of the local government family, despite the lion's share of our funding coming from central government. So a large part of our role is to represent local authorities and help them to understand and interpret new government planning policy, alongside helping local planning authorities to improve what they do and share learning across the planning sector. How do we do that? Just quickly, well, we do that in a number of ways. I'll probably highlight the network that we have in here, big network, really useful network, and the tools and information from our website. They're probably, in my mind, two of the most useful things. And of course, events, which is where we are today. So let's get on. I'm going to ask Katie, I'm going to stop sharing and ask Katie, if that's okay. Are you ready, Katie, to share your screen? Thank you.
Can everyone see now? Great. Hi everyone, nice to meet you. I'm Katie Gowers and I'm the lead in DEFRA on the biodiversity metric in DEFRA's BNG team. Prior to working on BNG policy, I worked as an ecologist advising on BNG. So I'm going to give us an introduction into the statutory biodiversity metric and describe how we made it statutory. And then I'll pass to my colleague Sam in Natural England, who's going to go into some more detail on the metric and the changes since 4.0. So before I get into the metric, I wanted to start by covering off the commencement regulations that we published last week, which confirmed when B&G will be applying for major applications and for small sites. So these regulations confirmed that for most major planning applications, the relevant date will be the 12th of February 2024. And I say most because there are some exemptions to B&G, so we also published our exemption regulations. And then for small sites, it's from the 2nd of April 2024. And then we have a delayed implementation for nationally significant infrastructure projects who come in under the Planning Act from November 2025. So what these dates mean is that any planning applications made on or after them will have a B&G condition imposed on their permission. And that means they'll have to submit a biodiversity game plan for approval by the LPA, and that shows how they'll meet their B&G requirement for that site. So this doesn't mean that if a planning application is already in the system ahead of those dates, they won't have a B&G requirement. So it's just when they're made on or after them. So if a planning application was made on the 10th of February for a major development, it wouldn't have a B&G requirement. And we've also put transitional arrangements in place, which mean that if an application didn't have a B&G requirement initially, if it's sought to vary its permission via a Section 73 application, it still wouldn't have a B&G requirement. But onto the metric. So I'll start by just outlining what the roles and responsibilities are for DEFRA in relation to the metric, and I think Sam's doing the same for Natural England in his presentation. So DEFRA is now the owner of the Statutory Biodiversity Metric. So previous versions of the calculation tool were owned by Natural England up till 4.0, and then that was handed over to us, and that formed the basis for the Statutory Biodiversity Metric. In line with that, DEFRA now hosts the metric package, and by that I mean the calculation tools, the user guides, and the condition assessments. We also produce Gov.uk guidance, both on how to calculate biodiversity value for the metric, but also broader guidance on the B&G framework. And we've been responsible for laying the related secondary legislation and metric for B&G in Parliament. So that's all been completed ahead of commencement. We're also responsible for updating the statutory metric on a 3 to 5 year basis. So this process is set out in the Environment Act and requires a statutory consultation ahead of us making any changes. And that 3 to 5 year period was picked as this provides certainty to developers, so we're not regularly changing the metric and their unit values, but also allows us to get best ecological evidence and update based on stakeholder feedback. And then just to cover how we made the metric statutory. So I've highlighted a couple of relevant provisions from the Environment Act here, one which defines the metric. So the biodiversity metric is a document for measuring biodiversity value for the purposes of B&G. And also we have a requirement to lay this metric before Parliament ahead of commencement. And that's essentially how we made it statutory. So to do that, we drafted something called an Act paper, which is essentially just a way of presenting information to Parliament. And we needed to take all of the information which makes up the metric and put it in that paper. So this involved us taking all of the information from the statutory metric calculation tool and the user guides and distilling it into this paper. So that includes all of the definitions of the data value inputs for the metric, such as condition, distinctiveness, strategic significance, etc. That includes all of the data tables, so all the multipliers for the different habitats, the rules for the metric and the key guidance, and then most crucially, the formula for calculating biodiversity value is outlined in that paper. Another key point is how this relates to the metric package. So when we laid that in Parliament, we referenced within it the various documents which make up the metric package. So we specified that the statutory version of the calculation tool has to be used in practice to calculate biodiversity value for B&G. The regard must be given to the user guides, so the methodology set out in them should be followed, and that the condition assessments that we published are used to determine habitat condition for B&G. So that's what essentially gives those documents their legal weight, is through the Act paper we laid before Parliament. And we laid that at the end of November last year. So essentially all of that information is now set in stone until the next update. So we got a lot of questions on why the user guides for the metric were draft. We won't be changing any key information because we've already laid them in Parliament. They were just draft so we could update based on stakeholder feedback and add some clarifying information. And then just briefly, I want to cover the difference between rules and principles and musts versus shoulds for the metric in the user guide. So there are 4 rules for the metric, which I won't get into detail on, as I think Sam is covering. But if these are broken, then the metric should be rejected at validation at that game plan stage. And this should be really easy using the statutory version of the metric tool because there are flags to show when rules have been broken. So for example, for the trading rules, If they're broken, it will flag up in the headline results and in the trading summary. And then we've got must, principles, and shoulds. So when we say must in the user guide, this means we have a legal basis to require something. So from either the Environment Act, the regulations, or the Statutory Metric Act paper. And then for principles and shoulds, we don't have a specific legal basis we're drawing upon, but there is a still requirement to have a regard to the user guide. So the methodology should still be followed. It's just a slightly less robust requirement. And that's just a brief introduction to the statutory metric from me, and I'll pass over to Sam. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Let's get these up and make sure everyone can see them. Is that sharing for everyone?
Yeah, I can see that too.
Great. Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Sam Wilson. I'm one of the senior specialists in Natural England metric team. And I'm just going to run you through, as we've mentioned, sort of an overview of what the Statutory Biodiversity Metric is, what it does, and sort of what's new between it and version 4. This isn't an in-depth kind of training course on how to use the metric or anything like that, so it's going to be fairly broad. But if there's any questions, obviously just put them in Slido and we'll come back to them at the end. So just a quick touch on B&G itself and the metric. As Katie said, the 12th of February is the date for major developments to have to implement B&G, basically, where it's going to be a requirement for a minimum of 10% net gain to be delivered. The metric is the way of showing that calculation, working out what it is that is being delivered by a project, and it does that by working out the baseline value of a piece of land, so prior to any works being done, comparing that against the post-intervention value, so whatever is being done to it, and then that comparison gives you your net gain score for the site. Just a quick one to touch on, that day one of mandatory B&G means that any application submitted on that day or after would be applicable for this. Before we get into it, we'll just look quickly at the evolution of statutory metric. So as Katie mentioned, it's now DEFRA's metric, but it's come about from this decade of development that's been delivered predominantly from a Natural England side, with input from all the other arm's length bodies and stakeholders. And joining me on the Q&A later is going to be Steve Panks, who's been part of this process right from the beginning. So he'll be able to help with any of those questions as well at the end. Katie covered DEFRA's role with the statutory metric. Natural England's role is a bit different now to what it has been in the past. So what's going to happen is that we will be making recommendations within those 3 to 5 year windows about any updates that we feel would be useful, and they'll come about from sort of internal advice from Natural England, but also other DEFRA colleagues, Environment, Energy, Forest Commission, but also those external feedback that we get that's really helpful from anyone who's using the metric and has an idea of what could be added to improve it. Once we've done that, then any change that might be made to the metric in terms of any unit values or anything like that, as Katie said, that needs to be consulted on before it can be submitted and made into the new version of the statutory metric effectively. Onto the metric itself. So hopefully all of you have now at least seen some metrics, so you know that it is an Excel workbook effectively that the metric uses as its front end for calculating biodiversity units. And it is a fundamental part of the B&G process, owing to the fact that it does that calculation for you. Importantly, from day one, then all applications are going to have to use the statutory metric, but that can be the statutory metric, sort of the main tool, or it could be the small sites metric statutory version as well. There's no transition arrangements, so that means that any project that hasn't submitted an application by day one would have to move their data across from a metric 4, for example, into the statutory metric. As we've touched on, the statutory metric was developed across a long period of time with consultation from the Environment, Energy, Forest Commission, other external bodies working with Natural England to implement those changes that were identified across the 10 years to make it into the tool that it is now. Effectively, what it does is provide that accounting process for losses and gains. And importantly, it's using habitat as a proxy measure for biodiversity rather than a sort of absolute value of every habitat there is. Includes all intertidal and terrestrial habitats and the linear habitat types that are present as well. But importantly, it doesn't include any marine habitats that's outside of the regulations for biodiversity net gain. Our best practice advice, and this is something that we're sort of trying to push home on every training session that we're giving, is that really the metric should be used as early as possible in that development process. And we're talking right back at site selection. If a baseline was done of a site to say this one's actually got a very high baseline, it would need lots of biodiversity units delivered afterwards in order to meet biodiversity net gain. So that development moves elsewhere to another site that's perhaps got a lower baseline, then the metric would have done its job there. It's not stopping that development, it's just moving it from a place where it would have a greater impact on biodiversity to an area where it would have a lower impact. So the tools, as we mentioned, and the statutory tools are now hosted by DEFRA, owned by DEFRA. So they're all available on gov.uk now. And as Katie said, that's the user guide, the metric tools, and the condition assessments. Natural England still hosts the sort of additional tools that aren't part of the mandatory process. So the things like the case studies and the GIS import tools and guidance, things like that, they're all still hosted on Access to Evidence by Natural England. And we'll just cover quickly what all of those are again shortly. Metrics is based on the mitigation hierarchy, so it's still the ideal that that is followed from avoid, mitigate, and then compensate. But by having the metric in place, it means that there's hopefully a sort of confidence and consistency of approach across the whole country, that what's being set out is the same everywhere. Importantly, it's here to aid decision making rather than being the tool that makes the decision. So just because the metric says that's a sort of 10% gain, that's all good. It doesn't mean that that should just be gospel whenever a metric comes in that's green, that is absolutely the right thing to do. It still needs that ecological input and sort of sensible decision making rather than just basing it wholly on the numbers. And importantly, as part of that, then the metric needs to be completed by a competent person. So that's how you make sure that you're getting that input from experts. That bottom bit is the sort of important caveat to keep reminding people of, is that where a river condition assessment needs to be completed, then whoever's assessing that needs to have river condition assessment training. It's my understanding that for day one, a list of the people who are assessed and accredited under that will be made publicly available. So it'll be possible to check across that as to whether that has happened. I've touched on units and how they are what the metric measures and how biodiversity net gain is calculated. But what exactly are they? They're a proxy to describe biodiversity based on the habitat type that they are. Importantly, there's 3 different categories of them. There's area units, hedgerow units, and watercourse units. And the important distinction between these 3 is that wherever there's one of them present at the baseline, you have to deliver your 10% net gain on each of those units. So you can't compare or swap between hedgerow and area units, for example. You would have to deliver 10% on both of them if they're present at your baseline. In this example here, we've got 100 units of area, 20 hedgerow, and 40 watercourse. So if that was your baseline, you'd need to deliver a minimum of 110, 22, and 44 units, respectively. Importantly, that doesn't mean that where you have no baseline, you can't deliver those. You can obviously still create units where you don't have a baseline. It's just there wouldn't be a measurable percentage against which you could say you've got a gain. What makes up a biodiversity baseline? It's these 4 factors. So you start with the habitat's area or length measurement, depending on whether it's an area or linear habitat. You then multiply that by its distinctiveness, and distinctiveness is sort of based on the habitat type and its features, and goes into sort of the rarity of that habitat and how well protected they are. Then you multiply that by condition, and that's what condition that habitat is in. versus its ecological optimum. And then against that, you times it by its strategic significance. Strategic significance is effectively how important that particular type of habitat is in that area where it is. So as you can see on the right-hand side there, there's 3 of those that require the user to input the data and say, this is what it is. And there's distinctiveness, which is automatically determined when the person filling out the metric assigns the habitat type. Once you've got your baseline, you then start to work with your post-intervention. And your post-intervention is made up of those same 4 multipliers from before, but then we add in these extra risk multipliers. They're called risk multipliers because they're there to basically reflect the uncertainty in any kind of delivery or that gap between a habitat being present and not being present. So the 2 that are automatically determined by whatever habitat type you're saying is being created or enhanced to are time to target condition and difficulty. Added into that is the spatial risk. Now, this one only applies where you go off-site, and it gets more significant the further from your impact site you are. So that's kind of a multiplier that's to drive interventions to be delivered as close to the site of impact wherever that's possible and reasonable. There's a few different mechanisms for delivering BNG, and the idea is that you work through these in sort of a certain order. So the first one that we would encourage that's tried is delivery of on-site units. So that's creation or enhancement of habitats within the red line boundary of a site. Sometimes that might be able to deliver all of the units that are needed for a development. Sometimes that might not be possible. Where it's not possible, that's when a development would go off-site. So off-site units would be those that are either present on another area of land owned by that developer, or it would be one that has been purchased from the unit market from a habitat bank, something like that, for example. And like I say, it can be fully on-site, it could be fully off-site if there was literally no room to deliver on-site, and it could be some combination therein. Now, as a final resort, when that can't be delivered, there's also the statutory credits, which will be available for purchase. There's a few caveats on statutory credits. So you can only purchase them if the units that you require aren't available in the market. And that does have to be agreed. And the developer would have to ask permission from the LPA to say, can I buy statutory credits because I've not been able to buy the units that I need? And just to sort of drum that point home, that is an absolute last resort. It should be on-site or off-site delivery first, wherever possible. As I said, we just get to what the tools were, and these are the ones that I mentioned earlier as being hosted on gov.uk. This is the statutory package, effectively. So the calculation tool that most people think of as the metric, that's the Excel spreadsheet where the data gets entered. The user guide tells you how to use that. And then the condition assessments are what need to be taken out in the field by the ecologist that's completing them to determine what the condition of those habitats on site are at baseline. In addition to that, we did touch on the small sites metric, and this is an alternative tool that can be used in, there's a certain set of circumstances where you can use it. At the moment, this won't be statutory until the 2nd of April. So that's when small sites have to use a metric to prove that they're delivering BNG. And the options would be to use the small sites metric or to use the main statutory tool. You can use either. The difference is that a small sites metric has works out a lot of the other multipliers for you, sort of at quite a high risk level. So they generate a higher baseline and potentially a lower post intervention than what the main metric would if you had it filled out by an ecologist. But it's there to allow people with less experience to go out and complete the metrics for simple sites. So if you imagine you had a site that was just entirely hard standing concrete, something like that, the small sites metric would allow someone to fill that out without the need of an ecologist to do it for them. The other metric tools that I touched on are the ones that are hosted by Natural England on Access to Evidence. You'll see there that the Technical Information Annex is currently the version 4 one. the new version hasn't been uploaded yet, so you can go into the historical information and see that for Metric 4, but it's not essential to being able to do any of the sort of use of the metric. It's just got the additional information on the background of the multipliers, things like that. So that's going to be available. And then we've also got the case studies, which sort of give examples of how the metric should be implemented in a few different scenarios. And the idea is that they'll be continuously sort of updated whenever we get new projects coming forward that haven't been looked at in a case study before. And finally, there's also the GIS import tool and guidance. What that does is just allow you to import a project from QGIS into the metric a bit easier. So now we'll look at the statutory metric and what's changed from version 4. So the main menu looks very similar. Anyone who's sort of opened a metric before will recognize this. The one thing to note is that it says the Statutory Biodiversity Metric rather than Metric 4 or any other version on it. And that's an important one to know when it's a check to see has the correct one been submitted. We're not going to go into sort of overwhelming detail on any of these changes, but I'll just run through some of the sort of most relevant ones. So we've split them out into these 3 categories. So there's been a few unit values that have been corrected, but they're pretty minor changes and wouldn't really be noticeable in the vast majority of applications. And even those where it did make a difference, it would be very small. It was just sort of very minor corrections of figures and things. In the calculation tool, there's been a fair few different changes we've made, and most of them have been trying to make the information just more accessible and easy to see. So, for instance, now if you go off-site, you have to provide a reference for that off-site site, and it just makes it easier to look at them all in one go and say, right, this is all related to that area. We've also added improved the irreplaceable habitats tab. So how irreplaceable habitats are assigned is slightly different to how it was in version 4. And it means that it's sort of all automatically pulled through onto that tab when the metric itself is filled in. So again, makes that process a bit easier. There's a unit shortfall tab, which just shows the sort of the difference in units from what would be needed to get up to mandatory 10% gain, basically. And also one of the big changes in the tool are we've added in these new error messages and error flags and things like that. And I'll cover those again a little bit later on. In the user guide, that's been sort of, again, minor tweaks, but just adding in a bit more detail where there's been specific things that we've had feedback in the past that might need a bit more clarity, things like that. So it should all be very familiar compared to version 4. But there is a few sort of key things that will hopefully make it a lot more user-friendly. So I touched on those checks and flags in the metric. This is just an example of some of them that you might see, but they basically work off a traffic light system, as they always have. So red is where there's a major issue, and this is going to be either a breaking of the rule or where biodiversity net gain isn't being achieved effectively. Those are sort of what these red flags represent. So in this example, it's mandatory now to complete the boxes for the date your metric was completed and who completed it. So that would flag up in red where that's not filled in. If those boxes are filled in, then it would clear that flag and they wouldn't be there anymore. Importantly to note, just for when you're reviewing them, they could be filled in any way. The flag is just to check if there's text in those boxes. So it's still worth having a look on there and just saying, does that say a person's name and does that give a correct date rather than one that might have been mistyped, so the wrong years in there, something like that. So those are the red flags. The amber flags are warning flags, just to say, have a look at this, make sure that what you're saying is right and you're happy with it. And where there's an orange flag, normally there's a space in the user comments box of the metric to add some information to it. So it might be, oh, why have you said this habitat is fairly good rather than good condition? What's the reasoning for that? Or it might be, you've not entered any hedgerow units in your site. Is that correct? So they're not issues that mean that something needs to be rejected. They're just things that are worth checking to make sure they haven't been accidentally missed or the wrong thing put in. And then wherever there's green, that means all good, rules have been followed, it can all proceed. So speaking about rules, I'll just quickly touch on the metric rules and what they are. For anyone who's sort of joined myself and Michael in the past on these training sessions, then we'll have run through these in a bit more detail. And they're broadly speaking the same as they were in version 4, just some of them have been slightly reworded or reordered. So rule 1 is that the trading rules have to be followed. And for those of you that aren't sure on what the trading rules are, they are how you determine what habitats in which distinctiveness band need to be replaced by what. In general, it's either the same habitat or a better one effectively needs to go back, but it's a bit broader than that depending on the different layers. So it's all laid out in the user guide. Rule 2 is that the outputs of metric are unique and can't be compared. And what this relates to is where you've got those 3 different types of unit, so area, hedgerow and watercourse, and just remembering that where you've got any of them present at baseline, you can't swap between them. You have to deliver 10% on each of them to make sure that you're meeting that mandatory 10% requirement. Rule 3 is that the correct tool must be used, and that is from the 12th of February, the statutory metric. That's the one that needs to be used. You can check that on the main menu tab, the start page. Any page in the metric where data's entered will have in the top of it the statutory biodiversity metric. So that's one thing that you can check really easily when you first open the tool. And finally, rule 4 is around exceptional circumstances where you know that there's going to be a clear ecological benefit delivered. Importantly for that one, that a developer can't just say we're doing rule 4, it has to be agreed with the LPA to say that yes, there definitely will be an ecological benefit. Where rule 4 can be used is laid out in the user guide. There's sort of a list of these are the situations where it would be appropriate to use it. And part of it is knowing that will be delivered, sort of having confidence that the people delivering it have done something similar before and will be able to achieve it. So those are the rules. Like Katie said, those are the things that need to be done with every metric. The principles are slightly different, as we touched on, but just to remind you of what those are. The first one is that the metric needs to be completed by a competent person. That definition of competency is in the user guide, so you can compare it against that to make sure that that's what is being done. Like I said, that's remembering that caveat that where a river condition assessment is done, then the person completing that needs to have that accreditation. Principles 2 and 3 sort of link together quite nicely. It's that the metric isn't overriding any existing protections or anything that's already done in the planning process. All of those ecology aspects still need to be covered. An existing professional best practice still applies. The metric isn't replacing any of that. It's there to work alongside it. Principle 4 and 5, again, tied together quite nicely. The metric isn't a complex ecological model. It can't sort of represent every single ecological feature of a site because the metric's using that proxy in the form of habitats for biodiversity itself. So that, again, is why we say that the metric is there to inform decisions alongside expert opinions, local knowledge, things like that. It all needs to work together rather than just looking at the numbers that come out of the metric. Interventions from the metric need to be appropriate and realistic. What we mean by that is that they should be deliverable within the sort of time frame of a project. Generally speaking, for BNG, we're looking at 30 years there. But it's also about making sure that the right habitat is being delivered in the right place. So not just saying something's going to go somewhere because that's what would make the metric make sense, but making sure that where that habitat is being put is appropriate for it. Principle 8 is that compensation should be local and strategic wherever possible. Obviously, that's not always the case. Based on that last thing that I said, then the most appropriate place for a habitat might be slightly further away. So that's fine in that circumstance. But wherever possible, we want to see compensatory habitat being delivered as local to an impact as possible. and where it can be, being related to those strategic goals in local plans and eventually LNRSs, things like that. And finally, there is no minimum habitat size ratio enforced by the metric. So what that means is you don't need to replace a hectare of lost habitat for another hectare of habitat. If the habitat you're proposing to replace it with is better, then you could deliver less of it, but still get your net gain. So that was a quick run through of the principles and rules of the metric. Now we're going to touch on reviewing metrics. So hopefully a few of you have been on our training courses before. You've seen this checklist. It's still subject to change because we're not quite at the 12th of February yet. But the idea is that this will be the sort of basis of it. So the first thing to check is the metric needed? So that'll be all major developments from the 12th of February, like we've said, small sites from the 2nd of April. After you've checked that, is it a site that would be exempt from the metric? Does it meet any of those exemptions? Then, is it the correct tool? Has that statutory metric been submitted in Excel format? And are there sufficient details on the start page of the metric? So date of assessment and assessor, as I touched on earlier, those red boxes that are on the start page. Then step 5 is to check whether there's any red boxes in the metric. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you sort of a new way of doing that that's been put in for the statutory version. If there isn't any red boxes, then we would say that that metric is fine to pass validation. Where there is red boxes, then it should go back to the ecologist, the developer, whoever submitted it. There is a few exceptions to that. So if there's a red box present, it could pass validation in one of these 3 circumstances. So the first is if it's an outline planning application. Second, if they're requesting permission to purchase biodiversity credits, because if they're buying credits, then by definition, they would have to still have a loss on their site. And finally, if Rule 4 has been used, because in Rule 4, that allows you to slightly change some of the things you put into the metric. So it might be that a rule has been broken or a red box is present. Looking at the red boxes and what I was touching on in terms of the new sort of flags that we've got, the key one is that one down the bottom there, the input errors / rule breaks present in the metric. That's a really useful one for when you're reviewing a metric, because that flag will appear if there's a red flag anywhere else in the metric at all. So if that one's there, then you know that somewhere else in that metric, even if you can't see it on the headline results page, there is a red box present somewhere, which means that somewhere a rule has been broken. That might be that the areas have been put in wrong, so the areas don't match. It might be that the person's name is missing from the first page, things like that. So if that is there, then you know that there's a box somewhere in there that means the rule is being broken. Alternatively, if there isn't, then you'll get this screen with sort of green on it. Basically, that box will disappear from the bottom, and then you'll know that that's there. The last thing to touch on in terms of reviewing is that, again, if you've been on some of our other courses, then you'll have seen the must, should, and could checklist that we've been working on. That's still in development, and the plan is that that is going to be sort of shared and available. And I know that Natural England are working with Richard and Becky at PAS to basically integrate that and develop a sort of training toolkit. But that'll come back to you from PAS, and they'll let you know sort of what's coming on that and when it's going to be available. So that'll be another method by which to go through sort of things in the metric, making sure that it's met all of those musts, and then going further as to has it met the should and coulds. So I think that brings me to the end of our slides. So we're going to go to Q&A, I think, and hopefully Steve will be able to join us.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Katie. Yeah, really useful, especially those sort of differences between statutory and version 4, the metric. Yeah, the flags and checks, the rules and principles, all interesting things, and the changes focused on improving usability, all really useful. We are going to go to Q&A. If you just bear with me 1 second. Yeah, we're going to go to Q&A. Just to manage expectations on the Q&A, we are focusing on the metric. Not necessarily, we've got a lot of questions on how BNG works in DM. Some of that is covered in our FAQs that we've already got online, but we are producing a BNG in development management training toolkit, and that's going to be a first draft of that's going to be showcased at tomorrow's BNG network event. So there'll be a lot more information on the DM side and how it works there. And as I say, anything we don't get to today, we are going to put them in our FAQs. So, right, let's see, where are we? Let's go to the first question. Okay, just get my screen there. Someone would like to clarify, do you use the extant restoration plan as the baseline for BNG for a minerals site?
Sam, did you want me to cover that one off? Yeah, so I guess it's quite difficult to know without the full set of circumstances, and it depends where you are in the process. Effectively, the baseline is looking at what was there sort of before. So if you've already if the restoration has already happened and so on, and something else was happening on the site, you would have a sort of different baseline to if you were trying to sort of baseline the actual sort of impact of the minerals site, really. So it very much depends. There's not really enough contextual information in that question to give it a fuller answer, unfortunately, at the moment. Perhaps we can take that offline and provide a bit more guidance on that.
Okay, certainly. So I'm not sure exactly who asked that question, but yeah, with a little bit more information, maybe we can get you a more full answer. Rebecca, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just to say that was from Buckinghamshire Council, so if they can let us know, we can obviously pass that one on. I just wanted to highlight there are a lot of questions in here around what's required at planning application stage in terms of metric calculations, and the fact that actually you only need to have the pre-development value submitted with at planning application stage, and that obviously impacts then of course on the red boxes in the metric. Just to say, as Sam and Martin have mentioned, we're working on this development toolkit, a DM toolkit for BNG, and that covers that, and that's what we're going to integrate this checklist into. I am yeah, just to say that we're going to be testing that with our network if you're part of the BNG network tomorrow, so you can see that. It won't cover the metric bits, but we will be working really closely with Sam and Steve and Michael on making that work, because obviously when that checklist was originally produced, we didn't know what was going to be required at planning application stage, hence why it's slightly off at the moment. So just to say that's clocked, but we won't we won't be covering questions on that today, because we just need to kind of pick that up, but it has totally been clocked, so don't feel your questions are being ignored. It's just we need to work out exactly how that's going to work in terms of sort of validation and that sort of thing, but we will be getting back to you as soon as possible on that.
Thanks, Becky. Next question we've got here is it essential that the LPA metric reviewers are MORPH accredited? I apologise, I'm not sure what MORPH stands for, but I'm sure one of you does. Do the LPA metric reviewers need to be accredited?
Sam, again, do you want me to pick that one up? I think in answer to what it stands for, it's basically the training system for doing the watercourse assessment. So it's sort of the accreditation system for that. And no, I wouldn't have thought they did in terms of just reviewing it. But again, it comes back to the level of competency. And if they're not understanding the information they're reviewing, it's seeking that sort of ecological advice from somebody who has been on that sort of training. So it's a question of whether they can understand the information that's interpreted, but they shouldn't have needed to do the full MORPH training to be able to understand that.
Okay, thank you. That's cleared that up. The next question is about the metric. It's macro enabled. However, as it stands, many LPAs cannot accept enabled macros due to it posing a higher cybersecurity risk. Is this being looked into?
I can take this one. Yes, essentially it is being looked into, and we added some information to the user guide on preparing your metric for submission, which is how to overcome this when you're submitting it to the planning portal. And then in the longer term, we're also looking into digitizing the metric, which will overcome some of these issues. So we've just started that piece of work, which will be running alongside the general metric updates, but that one won't be changing unit values. So it will just be changing the Excel tool into some kind of digital version that will overcome this in the longer term as well.
Okay, so there's a short-term solution and the longer term solution is based on it becoming digital and overcoming many of those issues. Okay, brilliant. The small sites metric states that a competent person should complete it, but that an ecologist is not required. Who else would be considered competent?
So I'll take this. Katie, did you want to take this one first? Or?
That's okay. I was just going to say there's some examples in the Gov guidance. I was going to highlight it could be landscape architects or project managers outlined in that guidance.
And then just to follow on from that, in terms of the small sites metric, because of its size, there's various different sort of risk-based decisions that have been taken to auto-populate a lot of the information, and it's envisaged it being used for a far smaller range of habitats. So it could be somebody who was competent in sort of assessing some of the lower range agricultural habitats, but not some of the more species-rich, diverse stuff that fills it in.
Okay, thank you. Penny Simpson reported earlier today that Schedule 7A, paragraphs 3 and 4 relating to the new BNG metric are not being commenced on the 12th of February. Could DEFRA please clarify?
So I haven't seen this, but I presume that the provisions in question about the metric are ones we already commenced. So we had some earlier commencement regulations, which we commenced ahead of laying the metric in Parliament. So it would just be that we've already done that and they're slightly separated from the main bulk of the commencement regulations. But I will find what Penny's written and respond to that.
Okay, thank you. Small sites will potentially require tiny parts of units. Is there a minimum unit below which we won't bother?
So for this one, there's a de minimis exemption. I'm not sure if they're talking about generally if they need to use the metric or whether they're talking about offsite units. There's a de minimis exemption. So if you're below that, you don't need to use the metric because you don't have a BG requirement. But for relying on offsites, I just suggested there was a really small number of units required that they look towards habitat banks rather than trying to get an offsite provider to just deliver a tiny bit of grassland or woodland. I don't know if that's going to have anything else to add.
No, I think you've covered most of the bases there, Katie.
Okay, so it depends. Is it on site or off site? Part to that question that would reflect would influence the answer. Thank you. Where will the list of river condition assessment trained people be posted so we can look it up if a person is competent?
Okay.
Where can we find out?
I don't know the answer to that one, Katie. Do you? Or is that something we might need to take away?
We might, almost Michael's popped up actually, but that might be one for us to check with the Environment Agency.
I can answer that one. I can't answer definitively where it will be available, but the organisation that provides the training and accreditation have said that it will be in the public domain from day one. So once we know where that is available and the URL, we'll make that available through the PAS BNG network forum.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Thanks for clarifying that. Is the intention that the metric will eventually move away from an Excel spreadsheet and towards online web page? I think we We answered that earlier, didn't we? Yeah, that is the
Yeah,
intention.
digital aspirations.
yeah.
We're not sure exactly what it will look like, but essentially, yes.
Okay. Question about the metric will show up as invalid when buying statutory credits. But wouldn't the same apply to off-site gains purchased from a habitat bank?
So it will flag up for statutory credits because there's a unit deficit, which is picked up in the unit shortfall tab as they're purchasing credits. For offsite, that will be included in the offsite tabs. So it shouldn't, because your offsite gains will match up with your onsite impacts, so meeting trading rules and unit impacts. So your metric should be complete and shouldn't have any flags when relying on offsite.
Okay, so when you're working in different parts of the metric, okay. What's next? What have we got? If the 4 rules are broken, would this be rejected at validation of the planning application or validation? Oh, that question's disappeared.
So this is what Becky was covering. I think they were still working through exactly what the validation list looks like, because there are minimum information requirements published in Deluxe Draft PPG, which are just slightly varied from validating the metric as the completed metrics required at game plan stage. So this is just one that we're going to take away and work through, I think.
Okay, thank you. Can I just wait for the next question to come up? If there are no development impacts within the 10-metre riparian zone, but BNG is proposed in the zone, is a river assessment still required?
So this is covered in the user guide, which states that if the site boundary crosses into the riparian zone, then you follow a set methodology, including adjacent lengths of watercourses and recording and assessing terrestrial habitats as well. So I think there was a response popped in the Slido link to that, which is probably easier than me going through it.
Okay, excellent. Essentially, the user guide covers that scenario.
Yeah.
Can the metric cope with several different offsite locations supplying units?
Yes, is the short answer to that, and there is an offsite reference list that's been, reference column that's been put in there as well to identify different locations.
Okay, thank you. Wait for the next question to pop up. All right, the one on local significance multiplier. Can the baseline value be high when developments propose to lose a local significant habitat and low for the post interventions?
So this is relating to strategic significance. So there was a bit of a change in the user guide methodology. As when LNRS come in, they will describe habitat actions and opportunities. And that's why the methodology is changed to say set it at low at the baseline and high for the post development for those sites. I think that's what that question is touching upon. And we need to clarify how that works in regards to documents used ahead of LNRS. That's a bit of work we're doing on that at the moment as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's see what's next. Could we please clarify how the difficulty risk multiplier works and how this intersects with conditions and distinctiveness categories?
Yeah, I'm probably best to take this one. So the difficulty risk multiplier is effectively reducing the value on the post-development side of the equation, taking into account the uncertainty involved in creating new habitats and so on. So that works alongside the distinctiveness bands. So the distinctiveness bands basically give a value according to the type of habitat that it is, whether it's a sort of species poor agricultural type pasture or perhaps a very species rich grass, and they will have different distinctiveness bandings according to the type of habitat and the relative importance of it ecologically. The condition part of it will assess the condition of those individual sort of pieces. And then in the post-development part of the equation, for each habitat, there's a predetermined value around difficulty and the timescale reflecting the different sort of risks associated with trying to recreate each habitat. So that's how they all interface together. I think if there's a more detailed sort of response required, then perhaps I'd direct towards training that Saeem run, or that the metric team are sort of running with PAS and so on, to get a bit more of a detailed sort of view as to how the metric works itself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Is strategic significance fixed at approval of the BNG plan, or should it be updated during the 30-year period if local nature recovery strategies change?
Good question, and it's fixed. So once you've approved that plan and you've discharged your condition, you kind of crystallise that gain, I'd say. So from that point, it doesn't change.
Okay, so it's fixed. Thank you. Is there a requirement to state the date the site was surveyed? If surveyed in January, but the metric completed in May, the data in the metric could be inadequate. So if there's a bit of a lag, I guess.
So ideally, you would flag that the metric was sort of completed when the ecological side of things was done. If there is a time lag between the two, there is a notes sort of column in the metric itself that can be used to identify that the survey was done in January, even if the metric was completed in May. So again, that's something to look out for, particularly in terms of the quality of the survey and the time of year that it was done and so on. So reflecting that in the notes column if there is a delay is quite useful.
There's also a requirement in the draft PPG for a date essentially confirming whether the biodiversity value of the on-site habitat is lower on the date of application, which relates to degradation, which is a slightly separate point. We just wanted to note that was covered there.
Okay.
I think also just to add to that, I think if I'm not mistaken, the gain plan does have something where you fill in this is the date the site was surveyed. You don't write it. You don't have to write it in the metric the date the site was surveyed, but in the gain plan you do have to write it.
Okay. I mean, are there any sort of parameters as to when something is if it's done in January and then the metric completed the following January, just to take an extreme case?
Yeah. I mean, in an ideal world, it would be done almost simultaneously, I think, in terms of process. So the minimum delay is what we'd be looking for. But I don't think we haven't got a fixed time scale in mind of what is too long. Yeah. But
I think there's best practice around habitat surveys. They typically expire in 2 years, I think. So I don't know if industry is probably developing some best practice on when that would relate to the metric, but it's probably on a similar time frame because you obviously don't want the habitats to change.
No. Okay, so I mean it's going to be individual applications, the assessor taking a view on the relevance of some of that where there is a delay. Okay. With spatial risk category, for county level applications, is compensation inside the local planning authority boundary taken as the entire county, or just the district the impact is in?
So it's the kind of depends which level the decision is being made at, but if it's being made at the county level, it's probably the county sort of boundary. That is further sort of complicated by the fact we can allow for the national character areas as well, so to allow for that sort of blurring of boundaries, but it would be basically within the local authority boundary that is determined in the application. So if it's a county scale, it probably would be within the county.
Okay, thank you. Depends on who's making the decision, right? The SSM, I don't know what that is. The SSM can't be used if priority habitats are present, but if there's no requirement for an ecologist to complete the SSM, could these habitats be missed? Statutory metric, I guess that is.
Yes, it's the small sites version of the metric. It has a limited range of habitats and so on. There is a priority habitat inventory that we would sort of steer people towards checking to avoid that sort of being missed, but there is a small risk that those sorts of habitats wouldn't be kind of identified if there's no ecologist, but we think that risk is kind of minimal really compared to the use of the main metric. Katie, I don't know if you've got anything to add there from DEFRA's perspective.
That we hope, obviously priority habitats are picked up now, but a minor development, so that would still be the same. And if the priority habitats were there, then they would need that ecologist. So I get what you mean. There is a risk if we're saying you don't need an ecologist, but one still may be triggered just in general for that site. So hopefully it's already captured in current processes, essentially.
Okay, thank you. Many applications come with spreadsheets where all patches of a particular habitat are aggregated in a single line. Will this be acceptable in the statutory metric?
So it should be acceptable when they are in the same condition and then being treated in the same way post-development. It's easier and more straightforward for everybody if it's disaggregated and just put in on individual sort of patches, particularly to be able to then pick out where there are lots of smaller patches that have been lumped together to make up that whole. But it is permissible to lump it together where they're being treated the same post-development and they're in the same condition.
Okay, so it's acceptable, but preferably these are disaggregated to make everything. Yeah. Okay. Ooh, are residential gardens treated any differently in the statutory metric compared with version 4.0?
I think they're treated the same as they were in 4.0. Sam, have you got any insight into any nuances?
I think you're right, Steve. I think the difference is around trees in private gardens, but that is covered in its own section in the user guide. So there is a specific section that tells you what to do in that scenario.
Okay, thank you. How does the statutory metric deal with additionality?
It's a big question. I don't think it, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve and Sam, I don't think it really does deal with additionality because we've got separate policy and guidance set out on what works. So you look at that and then work out whether you can use it for your B&G. And then in the game plan, you have to declare that you've met that additionality guidance. So perhaps something we could work on and trying to integrate it into future metrics to make that easier. Although thinking about that, it sounds very complicated, but we can certainly try.
Yeah, I think that just about covers it, Katie. I think it will be very challenging because of the breadth of additionality and the type of things that come in there to try and put that into the metric. And we've got this constant balance between trying to keep it relatively simple, but nuanced enough to be able to do the job that it needs to do. So we can certainly take away some thoughts on that. But for now, I think it's just dealing with additionality separately other than the metric.
Maybe in the future we'll have like a environmental net gain and a metric which deals with everything, which would be wonderful.
Okay, it's good. You're already looking at the next iteration. That's good. Consented schemes have a legal requirement to restore the site. If a new planning application is then submitted before the restoration is complete, what is the baseline?
It will be the baseline at the time of the planning application being submitted. But I don't know the specifics of that site, so yeah, I can't advise. But essentially, the baseline is done when the planning application is submitted. But I'm not sure about the specific consented development, so I'm happy to take that away if helpful.
Yeah. Essentially, if some improvements have been carried out, those will be taken into account once that new application came in as part of the baseline for that new application. But yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to be definitive because it's probably quite an individual case. Does the de minimis exemption to linear habitats of that question disappeared before I'd asked it, sorry.
I think it was about whether the de minimis exemption applies to watercourses from what I briefly saw. And
brilliant.
in the regulations, it outlines that linear habitats are those, it links to the metric essentially. So they would come under linear habitats, but I think because their priority, if we're talking about rivers, then they wouldn't be in the de minimis exemption. So it depends on the specific habitat essentially.
Right. Okay. Yeah. The questions reappeared. Yeah. It was about watercourses. Okay. If a survey is completed at an inappropriate time of year for habitats present, for example, January, then can it be rejected?
I think this is just in line with current policy and advice. So if you can reject a survey on the basis of it being completed at the wrong time now, then you still can for B&G.
Okay. So it's still that functionality to do that. Thank you. In metric 4, if a baseline habitat had good condition, it could not be enhanced to a habitat of higher distinction, but with a lower condition. Is this still the case?
It is still the case at the moment. It's a complicated one because of the way the maths work in the metric. It's due to an interaction between the distinctiveness bands and the condition bands and so on. That's too complicated to go into on this call, but it is something that we are aware of and looking for potential solutions to. The digital kind of aspect might well open up some different opportunities there, but for now it is still the same as it was in metric 4, unfortunately.
Okay, well, we've got that question recorded, so you can take that away. Let's see what's coming next. When veteran trees are on site, what is the standard process for identifying the area within the metric?
So the only option at the moment is to use the rural tree kind of aspect if it's in a rural setting, or the urban tree aspect if it's in the sort of more urban environment. It's recognised that that doesn't provide a true proxy value for veteran trees and so on, and they would be classed as irreplaceable habitat and excluded from the BNG approach anyway. So it would be just to flag them as irreplaceable habitats and then leave them as that. Potentially we might consider how we deal with veteran trees and things within the metric in future iterations, and that's something for us to take away and consider. But for now, just record them as urban or rural trees and flag them as irreplaceable habitat.
Okay, thank you. This question is saying, my understanding was buying units from a habitat bank needs receipt with BGP for approval. So would the habitat bank allocate specific I don't understand this question.
You're dealing with all the acronyms, but yeah. It's the
Can you read
biodiversity gain plan is the BGP. I think essentially they're saying that for habitat banks, there's a system in which you could just get receipt of buying those units, but that wouldn't work with the BNG framework. You would need to fill out the offsite tab. So you would need that specific allocation, which is recorded on the register and recorded in the offsite section of the metric tab. So that wouldn't work.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that. Are there plans for the centralised storage of all statutory metric data for all on and off-site BNG, similar to the Natural England off-site BNG register?
Yes, long-term plans. Obviously, we capture the metric data for offsite through the register, and then for onsite it's captured through the planning portals. But appreciate that's disjointed, and in a perfect world, we would take all of that data and be able to do wonderful monitoring and evaluation on it. But because of the disjointed nature of onsite and offsite and all of the different planning portal aspects, it means that's quite a big task. But ideally in the future, yes.
Any idea how near in the future or how far away? No.
Sorry.
Okay. The statutory metric has changed in relation to very high distinctiveness habitats. Is there further information on this?
Yeah, good question. We probably should have covered that in the presentation today, actually. So this has changed. So for previous versions of the metric for voluntary BNG, for very high distinctiveness habitats, the metric didn't calculate impacts to them and said bespoke compensation was required in each case. For mandatory BNG, this is the approach for irreplaceable habitats, and we have regulations defining irreplaceable habitats, and we modify the B&G requirement in relation to them. We don't have that for very high distinctions habitats that are not irreplaceable. So that's why the metric now calculates impacts to them and can calculate compensation for them. We have tried to maintain the status quo, though, in that there's still a bespoke compensation option in the metric, but we've set some rules for that in the user guide, because previously for compensation for these habitats, there were no rules set, and we had some feedback that this was leading to some negative outcomes for very high distinctions habitats. So we've set out those rules which allow a bit of flexibility, as there's a hierarchy of compensation, but say that the biodiversity gain objective has to be met and that priority should be given to like for like for these habitats. So I hope that makes that a bit clearer as to why we've made those changes. And just to flag as well that we do have the irreplaceable habitats consultation coming up at the last half of this year. And from that, we might extend the definition of irreplaceable habitats to include more of these very high distinctions habitats as well.
Okay, well, we're recording this, so it's now included in the presentation, so that's good.
Okay.
Local significance multiplier, how can we ensure it aligns or will not significantly contradict future LNRS? Will the biodiversity value need to be recalculated?
I'm not sure I fully understand that question. For the strategic significance, we have the documents that can be specified by the planning authority in the interim, and then when LNRS are published, they will be used to inform that multiplier. So I don't know if it's talking about the disconnect between now and then, but essentially we'll just transition into LNRS when they're all published.
Okay.
And just to add to that, it'll require the sort of ecologist, whoever's completing the metric, to provide that sort of interpretation and interpret the LNRSs, and then attribute the correct strategic significance multiplier accordingly.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it there. So thank you everyone for your questions. Obviously, we've not got to all of them. Not all of them are directly relevant today, but they are all relevant. We are recording all of them. We will respond to the ones that you know, are most relevant. I'm just going to ask, well, I'm going to thank Natural England and the DEFRA team for dealing with those questions and filling in some of the gaps. I'm going to ask my colleague Becky, if that's okay, just to come in and say a last few words regarding some of the questions.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks everyone for all your questions. There are a lot of questions there around how BNG works through the planning system, more general questions. Just a couple of points of clarification. BNG will mandatory BNG only applies for planning applications submitted on or after the 12th of February. That's majors. And then for non-majors, only if they are submitted on or after the 2nd of April. It doesn't count for reserve matters, anything like that after that date. So if you've got a planning application that came in before that, even if it's not been validated, it doesn't count under mandatory BNG. It's worth noting though, obviously if you've got a local policy, that would apply, and the NPPF. It also won't account for appeals that happen if the planning application came in before that date as well. So just to make that really clear, because that question's been asked quite a lot. We do hope that the PPG, the Biodiversity Net Gain PPG, which is out in draft, is going to make that a bit clearer, because I think it's coming up a lot. Around what's required at planning application stage, there are some legal requirements about what's required at planning application stage, but the PPG also makes it clear that probably to determine whether BNG is going to be possible, there may be other stuff that's required. PAS is looking at this very closely, and we're working with DLUP and DEFRA on this. It relates to what your metric looks like, because there's going to be a lot of red flags in there if they only submit the information they're required to legally, because it doesn't require any post-development info. We are doing some work, as folk have mentioned, on a sort of DM toolkit. We have, for those of you that don't know, we have a biodiversity net gain metric that's open to any LPA officers. I'll reopen the chat and put a link to a form that you can fill in if you'd like to join that. It's open to anyone. It's got an online forum. We also run meetings. We have a meeting tomorrow. We're going to run through a draft of that sort of toolkit to test it with people, see what you think. But that will be coming out soon. And the plan is we'll then integrate the metric side of things into that, but we obviously need to have a conversation around exactly how that works, because it's a bit tricky with validation for the legal requirements versus what you might like to see at planning stage. It's not altogether clear, so that needs some work. And obviously, I guess for people to understand that, you know, we didn't know until the end of November what was going to be required in terms of those legal requirements. So it's been, you know, quite a fast turnaround in terms of understanding that. But I know it's really tricky for you guys as well, because validation teams need to know what to validate, etc. I guess my main message on that would be, it's majors coming in on the 12th of February. We've got a bit more time to work it out for other applications. I would really hope that anyone putting in a major application has been speaking to you already and done some pre-app, so they would be clear, and they should really know that they're doing BNG, those developers. So I would hope that they would have the information they need at the right stage. But just to say, we are working on this, and we're very much trying to get that info out to you as soon as we can. So yeah, watch this space, and we'll sort of get comms out on that. But please don't feel that there's a lot of questions there. I know many of the most popular questions we kind of just diverted because they're not really relevant for today's event, and I know that's really frustrating for you guys because you want those questions answered, but we haven't lost them. So I just wanted to say that. Thanks very much, Martin.
Thank you. Well, you've done a good start to summing up. I mean, yeah, thank you again to all of you that have taken part today, for giving us your time. These sessions are really important for us to put on, but also for you to participate in and ask questions. And without sort of laying this on too thick, we don't ignore the questions. It's just for some events we have to be economical with the time. We're going to launch a couple of polls, just 2 or 3 quick polls, if my colleagues could launch those, just to ask you what you thought about today's session, because it helps us for future sessions. Yeah, as Becky says, other events coming up, please look on the PAS website for information on those. So yeah, I think have the polls been launched? Yeah, okay, good. Slido will remain open for a little while, so if you thought of some questions afterwards, we'll keep that open for a little while. You can put some more questions on. Yeah, I think I'll wrap things up now. So once again, thank you particularly to our audience, and especially to Natural England and DEFRA colleagues for their inputs today. And yeah, have a great afternoon, and we shall see you all at another event soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.